And then I will show some slides also of La Mula. So I will. So now you are co-host.
Very good. All right, and I see David is here as well
David.
as an attendee.
Yeah.
Hey, David, good to see you.
Now he can talk.
Cool.
So, hello, David. Hello, David.
Hey, good morning.
Oh, you're like a robot, David.
You are like a robot.
Good morning. No.
Yeah, that's not a great connection, David.
I'm in a bad spot. Or
Yeah, no worries. So it is right now just past 9 a.m. here in San Rafael at Boot Coffee Campus. And we are ready to start this Giesen webinar, which is focusing this time on espresso. And espresso, of course, is a brewing style. And there are also some specific parameters for roasting to take into consideration when it comes to espresso. And we are going to cover today some theory, some practice, and we are, of course, ready also to answer some questions. I have with me here Marcus Young, the campus director of Boot Coffee Campus. Hey, Marcus, good morning.
Hey, good morning. Good to see you, Willem.
Good to see you. You can see it's spring has started just officially this week, and we can see that spring is also coming into Boot Coffee Campus. This is normally a rather chilly time of the day at the campus, but now the sun is coming in full glory. That is very nice.
Yeah, I have
So,
windows wide open and birds are singing outside,
yeah.
so it's lovely.
And I hope that the participants in other parts of the world or other parts of the US have the same enjoyment. Of course, those that are attending from other continents, other hemispheres, they might be on opposite seasons. So today we, as I mentioned, we are going to focus on espresso. And we have a presentation prepared for this. We will start this quite soon. So, but maybe first, before we start presenting the topics as part of this webinar, maybe Marcus, you have a pretty long history and experiences with espresso. I believe you've been a World Barista event certified official judge. You've been tasting probably thousands of espressos. You've tasted great espressos. You've tasted mediocre espressos. You've tasted possibly nasty espressos. So when we enter into this exciting realm of espresso, what aspects should we take into consideration?
Yeah, I think espresso is such an interesting method of preparing coffee, and one of the challenges I think from a product development standpoint or a QC standpoint is, it's a brewing method that's very aggressive. It turns up the volume on certain aspects of coffee. And also it's quite finicky. So if little things are done wrong, or maybe different than the way you prepare espresso in your lab or in your cafe, somebody might be tasting effectively a totally different beverage, right? And that's all just amplified by the fact that in an espresso, we're talking concentrations that are, maybe 5 to 10 times more intense than a filtered cup of coffee. So, little changes can make a big difference.
Yep.
I also think, as in my, nearly 20-year career, of course, I've seen a lot of technical enhancements on the espresso machine side, from the popularity of, just simple semi-automatic machines to, pretty good super automatic machines. But even now, it's so common to find cafes and baristas with the ability to pressure profile their espresso, to ramp up pressure, to decrease pressure, to have custom temperatures at multiple group heads, allowing them to brew different coffees in different ways. That I think in some ways espresso now is kind of this brave new world, right? And it's always fun to look at like trends regionally, where here in the U.S. I think my experience has been the West Coast is kind of in this realm right now of longo shots, like high volume, very, sometimes very long brew recipes. Sometimes I've gone into cafes here and seen espressos served in cappuccino cups because, for every 1 gram of espresso in the portafilter, they may be getting 3 grams of liquid or 3.5 grams of liquid out, which is like totally breaking the rules. Whereas, you go to New York or you go to different parts of the world.
Which is like 3 grams coming out is very little, right?
Well, no, but for every 1 gram of coffee in the portafilter, right? So if you have
okay.
put in 20 grams of coffee in your portafilter, the kind of typical, world may have been like a 1-to-2 ratio. So for 20 grams, you would end up with 40 milliliters by weight out.
So it's the opposite. It's
the opposite.
Yeah.
But you go to the west, to the East Coast, or you go to Europe, and you see these much more concentrated, more ristretto shots, where maybe that 20 grams in the portafilter is only yielding 20 to 30 milliliters in the cup. And boy, as a roaster, it's really challenging, right? How do you account for vastly different sort of local traditions on how the coffee is brewed? How do you roast an espresso that tastes great, as a single shot? But at least here in the US, if a cafe is serving 10% single shots of espresso, they're selling a lot of espresso here. It all goes into milky drinks, lattes and cappuccinos. So, having a coffee that's balanced and delicious, both standing on its own as espresso or when combined with milk, is another challenge. Even something, we've seen in barista competitions with which Willem mentioned. Oftentimes you will see competitors now changing their entire brew recipe from their espresso course to their milk course in order to highlight different aspects of that coffee. So, from a roasting perspective, I think it's really, in some ways, it can be challenging to accommodate that. On the one hand, I think some of us get a little bit lucky. I've helped roasters and I've worked on roasting profiles for a lot of barista competitors. So in those cases, of course, you can sort of roast the coffee so it tastes delicious and rely on the barista to make it taste great and to provide feedback to you as a roaster on little changes you might make. But in a practical production environment, you have to accommodate baristas of wildly different skill levels using a variety of different pieces of equipment, and still, creating a product that bears your company name and that you can really stand by proudly. So I think that's where different roasting approaches for espresso start coming in. Oh, go ahead, Willem.
Yeah. I just want to kind of, if I try to summarize like the past 15 years, let's say, right? When we started working as Boot Coffee with roasters and helping them develop espresso blends and espresso roasting styles for those blends. We saw that from that time, from that millennium change to, you know, 5 years after, there was still the tradition of roasting everything very dark, especially here in the Bay Area. And it was like some specialty roasters saw their espresso as the excuse to even take it a bit more darker, right? And as you mentioned, that aggressive brewing style of espresso will then filter out even more of these carbon-like, smoky-like flavor notes, and that automatically forced roasters that were sticking to these darker roasting styles to maintain, like in southern Italy, very short shots. So ratios, you know, that were 1 to 1.5 or 1 to 1.75. And then, you know, we saw about 10 years ago, we saw there was a change coming in terms of roasting styles becoming lighter. And I remember here, for example, in the San Francisco Bay Area, which has often been kind of a trendsetter next to Seattle and next to Portland, we saw these roasting styles getting lighter. And then now there was something new coming in espresso that had been hidden before, that was acidity. And I think in hindsight, things were from a roasting style so light, suddenly roasters often did not know, or their baristas did not know how to handle all that acidity. And now you could taste espressos that were so acidic with, you know, the acidity, like, yeah, almost like a close to vinegar type of acidity, which is very, very acidic, right? And it seems like
milk acidity, right? Like,
yes.
Yeah.
And then, you know, now we've seen roasters and their baristas getting more adjusted to this. Roasting styles are still relatively light in perspective of what happened, let's say 10, 15 years ago. But roasters have become more accustomed to seek a sort of balance in their roasting style to accommodate what they feel is right for their espresso brewing style. Do you agree with this summary that I just gave?
No, I do, and you hit the nail on the head with that one word, balance. Because, you know, whether you're, I think, roasting on the darker end of the spectrum or on the lighter end of the spectrum, ultimately, I think espresso needs to be balanced, and it should be a balance of the bitter compounds in the coffee. But that's, you know, moderated by the sweetness that you can pull out when you're pulling a shot of espresso. And then, of course, all of that is kind of elevated by the acids that are there, that we know are there, be it a sour vinegar acidity, which wouldn't be very balanced, or a more citric or malic, or you know, even like a lactic acidity in a darker roasted coffee, you know, creates this idea of balance. And, you know, when we talk about espresso, and it's partly my background, but I recommend it for all roasters, take a look at the World Barista Competition score sheets. I mean, it's a great sort of QC tool. It's a great tool to give you some direction in looking at how, you know, a major part of that score is it a balance of sweet, sour, and bitter? And then is it also a balanced mouthfeel, right? Is it sort of round and smooth, or is it more like flat and rough? It's a great way to sort of start approaching espresso that allows for a lot of variation in roasting styles and coffee selection.
Yep, it's very intriguing. In all my years, I've found the quest for balance in espresso or roasting styles that ultimately are applied to espresso. I found that the most compelling, most challenging, most rewarding, most humbling aspect of this profession.
And I want to just add, one other thing that's changed in the last 15, 20 years has been a move, not away from blends. Blends are still super important, but this sort of embracing of single origin coffees as espresso, where you still are allowing that terroir and the character of a specific farm and producer to also come through an espresso the same way we think of it with a filter coffee.
Yeah. So, so today's program is we have a presentation, and we are going to do some live roasting. For this purpose, we're going to use a coffee that is very dear to us. That is from La Mula. And I think, Marcus, you have used another coffee, but first maybe I would like to share some information about La Mula, and then Marcus will share some information about the coffee he has used prior to this webinar for the pre-webinar exercises. So the La Mula that I'm going to use in the live roasting session, maybe I'd like to just share a little bit of information about this coffee, so that we are a bit educated about that, and then we will have Marcus comment on the coffee he has used for the pre-webinar session. And now you can see my screen, Finca La Mula, Panama's smallest geisha farm. You can see it, right?
Yep.
Good. So this is a farm that I started about 13 years ago. In 2007, it was fully planted. And Panama, of course, is a origin that became famous because of the discovery of the geisha coffee. The flavor of the geisha was first really discovered in Panama. Geisha was born as a variety in Ethiopia, of course, the birthplace of all Arabica coffee. And when we started to develop La Mula, we first looked at, where is this farm located? And you can see here kind of a shot from, or a display of the actual geography of that part of Panama, which is close to the border with Costa Rica. You can see the volcano, the Baru volcano, and then east from that, or west from that, the Boquete Valley, and then you can see kind of south of the pinpoint where the volcano is indicated, or the peak, you can see the Finca La Mula, and 1700 to 1800 meters, so 5,500 feet to 5,900 feet. So it's a farm that is quite remote, it's quite high in perspective. Crops start a bit later than in other farms in Panama because of that elevation. And so, knowing that this farm is relatively high, that automatically also has consequences for the potential acidity levels and the intensity of those flavors. Here you can literally see where the farm is located. If you look at my index finger on this photo, and it is remote, it is not easy to get to, but it's an exciting journey. Marcus and I have made this trip many times with students, and this is actually the view you get from the farm after you've made the hike up. You're rewarded with this beautiful view, and you can see far on the horizon, you can see kind of the glitter of the Pacific Ocean, which is interesting. The farm is, for that reason, is one of the closer farms to the Pacific Ocean, and that is part of the unique terroir. Of course, the soil, the actual soil, which is very rich with organic compounds, is an important aspect of that terroir. And here you can see on a typical visit to Finca La Mula, the cloud forests that surrounds the farm really slows down the ripening of the cherries. It slows down everything. And the shade of the higher trees of the canopy surrounding the farm is also providing extra elements that will give the coffee something truly unique. In this short video, you can see here you can see, you probably cannot hear the audio of the video, right? No. But in the commentary of this video, you can hear about the biodiversity, the wildlife, the beautiful just diversity of the surroundings. And at La Mula, we grow two types of geisha, the green tip and the bronze tip. And if you look at this photo at the right side, you can see the bronze tip is the left hand. The cherries, the ripe cherries, are a bit bolder. They're also, when you taste the cherries, it's just a very intense sweetness, while the green tip, which is the right hand on this photo, has a more pronounced acidity. And we have a 75-25 mix of these two types, 75% bronze tip, 25% green tip at La Mula. And here you can see again the distinct differences between these two types. We have some spontaneous hybrids. There's a orange geisha growing, so these cherries actually turn more off to a shade of orange when they ripen, which is really interesting. We are now separating and propagating this variety to try to replicate this, because this could be a spontaneous, different genetic strain. And here you can see one of our workers, harvesters, showing some ripe, freshly harvested cherries. And here are the different stages of ripening, where we of course look at the ripest possible cherry, which is the darkest, more purple, burgundy, purple red cherry, providing most sweetness. Some clients take La Mula to the extreme level and have the logo printed on their foreheads. And we have some amazing following in that regards. So that gives you a little bit of the indication of La Mula. And so I've gotten to know La Mula in terms of its flavor profile as a coffee that features notes of blackberry with a like blackberries, with a base of acidity that is quite intense, and the acidity is multi-layered, where you have not only the acidity of blackberry, but maybe also of a raspberry, and then it has these classical geisha features like bergamot, jasmine, some florals, but there's always this balance between those brighter fruit notes and the more darker, deeper flavors of these berries that I mentioned. And so that's the coffee we will roast today. So now I will stop sharing this presentation, and now Marcus, now I would like to pass the microphone to you to provide some backgrounds of roasting tips and strategies for espresso.
Yeah, thank you, Willem. I wanted to talk a little bit about how I approach a coffee. It's a coffee that we know quite well. I specifically chose this coffee. It's a coffee from Colombia, from the Coffee for Peace program that we're involved with.
So this is the coffee you chose for the exercises prior to this webinar, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, okay.
So I captured, I basically roasted the coffee a couple of different ways. One sort of a standard profile that I use for this coffee, for, kind of a filter coffee, kind of an everyday drinking profile. And it's, a really lovely coffee, like I say, from a producer in Colombia, Diego Agudelo. That, it's a coffee that I think is generally characterized by, as a filter coffee or on the cupping table, as a coffee that's very sweet, that has a lot of sort of chocolate characteristics and a quite pronounced citric acidity. And so I have a little presentation here about how we approach this coffee as espresso. And then I also just wanted to share a couple of notes about blending if you're doing espresso blends. But I think, it is, first of all, important just to get on the same page. This is some definitions of espresso that come, primarily from the Specialty Coffee Association. So they're kind of industry standards. And of course, an individual cafe might break all of these rules as well. But yeah, it is important to remember that espresso is a way of brewing coffee. There's nothing indicative about any specific coffee that makes it appropriate for espresso. And as we sort of talked about, as Willem and I were wrapping during the introduction, it can be roasted any way. It's not like there's a definition of an espresso roast. It's just a coffee that you happen to brew according to specific techniques using an espresso machine. And then below here is how the SCA sort of generally talks about the brewing parameters of espresso, where for like a double shot, which we always pull, you'd be using somewhere between 14 and 20 grams. From that, you would have a brew ratio. So you would take that input and multiply it by 1.5 to 2.5 and get your output in between 20 and 30 seconds using clean, sort of calibrated water. And the big kicker for espresso is that we're doing this under pressure. So 9 to 10 atmospheres of pressure. And so, of course, the general way to think about it is you're taking finely ground coffee compacted into a portafilter and forcing hot water through it to make a concentrated beverage. But what does that mean for roasting? I think, I've captured sort of two profiles that are quite similar in some ways, but different in others, that showcase what happens when you take a coffee and prepare it as espresso. And so remember, this coffee that I'm going to talk about having roasted, this was actually roasted a few weeks ago, but I was tasting it as espresso again over the last few days. It's quite distinct. And so, this is an approach. This is a grab from the Giesen profiler, just from the PDF that you can review of any past profiles, that shows one approach to this coffee. So you can see a total roast time of about 10 minutes, 15 seconds, first crack happening at about 9 minutes. It's a fairly dense coffee, so we had a fairly, represented by that yellow line, a fairly intense application of heat at the beginning to get that high rate of rise that then declines throughout. And then a fairly stable airflow represented by the purple line. And if we really kind of break this down into what it means to prepare the coffee, and what we were looking at with our roasting phases, you can see that, the development time was fairly compact, about 16%. This is a medium roast. I don't have it written down here, but the color when we measured it with our Javalytics on the Agtron scale came in at about 62 for this particular roast. And like I say, if I tasted this roast on the cupping table, I would have a lot of chocolate, sort of caramelized sugars.
And that's 62 on the beans?
On the beans, yep.
Okay.
And just a really nice, like sort of balanced cup, either on the cupping table or as filter. But as what this flavor wheel here represents is what I tasted when I prepared a shot of espresso. kind of using a typical approach, right? So it was about a 1-to-2 ratio. My brew time was 26 seconds. I put 18 grams in my portafilter and was targeting about 38 grams before I saw signs of over extraction. But what I got in the cup, as you can see here, was not very balanced. We talked about that idea of balance. This roast profile prepared in this way was a citrus show. It was very lemony, very tart, not a whole lot of nuance. There was kind of just like a mild honey sweetness and kind of a slight citrus floral character, but it was really dominated by these citrus flavors. And not captured here was the acidity, which I would have ranked incredibly intense, and the sweetness, which was sort of moderate, and like the bitterness, which really wasn't there, kind of giving it any backbone. So I had to think, okay, how do I want to approach this coffee in order to create it a slightly more balanced cup as espresso? And this was all just brewed on a standard Linea PB, not using any bells or whistles. We weren't using pre-infusion. It was just calibrated to 202-degree brew temperature at the group head. So nothing fancy in the brewing, just kind of a workaday approach to brewing coffee as espresso. So I made a couple of decisions. One was I wanted to slow down my rate of rise decline a little bit. I wanted to extend the kind of middle phase of this roast, which you can see represented by that orange line, which is the rate of rise. You can see it still peaks, but it comes down to just before color change, and then it's a little bit more stable throughout the roast. I also now have a much longer roast time. So I've now extended the total roast time in order to extend that development, that Maillard phase, those browning reactions, and also the development time. So if I break this down, you can see now I've gone from a 16% development to an 18%. Doesn't seem like a big difference, but that combined with the longer total roast time and more of those sort of caramelization reactions leading up to and through first crack creates a cup like this. So when I taste it now as espresso using virtually the same recipe, virtually the same ending color, now you can see that the profile here is predominated by sweetness. It's brought in this sort of layer of complexity with dark chocolate. It still has a lot of fruit and a lot of sort of acid-driven fruit flavors, so it's still an acidic cup, but much more balanced with like dried fruits like grapes and like raisins actually, and also this sort of more, not necessarily more interesting, but more of like this deeper plum sort of stone fruit characteristic, which again, it's sort of indicative of the increased sweetness that I was also finding in this cup. I'll also say that the mouthfeel or the body with this roasting approach went from being sort of like, smooth, but sort of flat, kind of just fleeting aftertaste, not a lot of weight on my tongue, to now being like much more round and sort of all encompassing in my mouth. So I think that this was a fairly successful approach to kind of a modern interpretation of this coffee as espresso.
And so you basically aimed at the same roast color, but basically get to that color in a different way. Is that how you approach this?
Exactly. It was a color that, I think all of us as roasters, we sort of get into maybe a little bit of a comfort zone or a little bit of our own style that's maybe largely driven by color. This was an approach that I thought could be balanced because it's so balanced on the cupping table at that sort of roast level, but with a shorter development time. So I wanted to sort of extend some of these phases a little bit, particularly the kind of late Maillard and then that development time, in order to, hopefully develop these compounds that would increase the sweetness, but start muting the acidity. Because I think the first thing to think about when you're approaching a coffee for espresso is that typically the espresso machine will turn up the volume on acidity. And a cup that might be very balanced when brewed as filter coffee can become pretty quickly, it can dip into the sour end of things.
And when you are addressing acidity, knowing that acidity can consist of various types of acidity compounds. We have citric, we have malic, we have tartaric, we have phosphoric. We have some bad ones, like the acidity that is also part of like a vinegar type of acidity. So we have lactic acidity. What type of acidity are you referring to here?
Yeah, in this coffee, the primary acidity that I find on the cupping table in the espresso is a citric acid.
Okay.
So it's that acid that can be very tart and sour on one end, right? I always encourage tasters to sort of think about their experience, and the first thing that if the first thing that jumps into your mind is sour. I'm trying to go back in my presentation, but somehow I lost control. Give me 1 second. If the first thing that comes to your mind is sour, that's probably not indicative of a very balanced cup. And that's exactly my experience with this. It was sour, like biting into a lemon or like an orange that's not quite ripe. Whereas when I got over here, the quality of the acidity was still citric. It was still that sort of bright characteristic, but it was much juicier, much more like a sweet orange juice than just biting into a lemon. And so, of course, the other approach to creating an espresso is also to think about blending. And definitely the trend has sort of moved towards single origin coffees. Roasters spend a lot of time talking about them and promoting them. But also when I sit down with clients and look at their sort of mix of coffees and what they're selling the most of, it's very often their blends. So it's important to really think about blending because, with a blending approach, you can accomplish the same goal of balance. And you do that often by sort of thinking of a backbone to your coffee that offers a very broad sweet spot. Maybe a coffee that the primary characteristic isn't its acidity, it isn't fruit. Instead, it's chocolate, it's sugar, it's brown sugar, it's sweetness. And then, of course, you can come in, right? Maybe this is like a Brazil that you can buy at a fairly good price, right? And then you can sort of highlight that maybe with a Kenyan coffee or a brighter coffee from Latin America that kind of gives you these high notes. And and just a few notes about blending. I think in the future we can focus on this perhaps in future sessions. But blending can take a lot of time, and it's important to have a methodology for sort of going through your trials and seeing how different coffees work together. You'll spend months doing this if you're going straight from the roaster to the espresso machine. So instead, it often just starts with various components that are roasted on the cupping table, literally just wet blending them. So taking 2 scoops of Brazil, 1 scoop of Kenya, 1 scoop of Indonesia, and seeing how they taste. And when you sort of get to a point where that's tasting good, you could try blending the components, perhaps try them as espresso, continue making adjustments in your product development. And then moving into the next big question, which we could spend probably 2 months arguing about, which would be, are you going to blend these coffees before you roast and roast them all together? Or are you going to roast the coffees individually and then blend them? And so, I mean, we could get into that if we want, but I want to make sure we have time for Willem to roast as well. But I'll just leave with a teaser, which is that I have moved much, much more often to pre-roast blends as I've moved through my career, especially for espresso.
Yeah, I think we have enough time, Marcus. So no worries about that.
Yeah, good, good. Because yeah, I mean, I think,
And I have some questions for where it comes to blending with espresso, because there is this aspect when it comes to roasting for espresso, is that the best espressos, as I have been testing them, are not necessarily fresh from the roaster. That they ideally require, I would say, at least a 7-day rest. Maybe according to some, this can even be extended to 2 weeks post roasting. So what contributes to that aspect of having to wait with your espresso preparation and testing so many days after roasting? Why is that?
yeah, I mean, I think um, the most obvious answer is that it's CO2, right? And if you prepare a shot of espresso with very fresh coffee, you'll have a huge crema layer, which may be beautiful and it may contribute to a nice mouthfeel. Um, but it also probably contributes some sort of muddled characteristics to it. And I think there is this flavor of carbon that's very much like a carbon dioxide flavor. So it doesn't taste roasty like a dark roasted coffee, but it is this sort of muddled, rough flavor. And that's from very fresh roasted coffee. So I think, as the coffee ages and it off gases a little bit more, the first thing that's happening is you're just sort of gaining control over that carbon. And you can take a 2 or 3 week old coffee, brew it as espresso, and still have beautiful crema. Perhaps just
And,
not as much of it.
and so espresso is also identified as a concentrate where you create an emulsion of oils and gases, right?
Exactly.
But the gases that we refer to here are not necessarily the CO2 gases. These are gases, aromatic gases, created because of the intense pressure and extreme environment that you expose the oils to. Is that correct?
Yep. Yep.
So in other words, when you have an espresso that is very fresh from roasting, which means there is still a lot of CO2 locked into the cellular structure, then that CO2 becomes basically a party pooper. It starts to conflict the gas of that CO2. It starts to conflict with the other aromatic properties of the coffee, and that is I guess for espresso, that is a very disastrous thing, right?
Yeah, I think it can be. And it's always interesting to talk to roasting companies and things about how they manage that, right? Are you delivering your coffee directly fresh to your customers, sort of right out of the roaster? Or, more and more roasting companies that I talk to are now staging their coffee and not even bringing it to their customers until it's maybe a week off the roast. So they're sort of getting the coffee in that window of where they want it to be brewed for espresso. I also think very fresh espressos are very hard to brew. So it's just harder on a barista to sort of dial in and keep that coffee consistent, where you'll have more stability, say a week or two off roasting. And often I find that the coffee just becomes more balanced. I mean, it is another technique where the acidity is a little more balanced. Often the sweetness becomes a little bit more complex as that coffee rests and ages a little bit. It doesn't oxidize, it doesn't get stale, it's protected, but the compounds do continue developing and evolving over time.
Interesting. Could you go back to the section of the presentation where we talk about blending? Because I'd like to just show a little bit more of these underlying aspects to our audience.
Of course.
Yeah. So could you maybe elaborate a little bit more on the blending for espresso, and then specifically taking into consideration the choices we have to make for roasting?
Yeah, I mean, I think with blending for espresso, it's like with any other blend or really with any other decision around your coffee is it starts with some decisions about why are you producing this coffee, right? What are the goals of this blend? And those goals could be driven by price. They could be driven by the coffees that you want to use. They could be driven by certain customer requirements. So I think, really kind of understanding, what are your goals when you're setting out to create this blend? Creating a house blend that bears your company name and is your best seller is going to be a very different goal than crafting a blend that's value priced, that's going to go out to your, like a large bakery chain that's requesting your coffee. So I think having those goals in mind is really where it starts. And then once you have those goals in mind, you start thinking about the component coffees. Because the largest single component is going to contribute the most to the quality of that coffee. And then the additional coffees that you add kind of become the highlighter on that. And, and I think blending can do a couple of things. I mean, if you're really focused on kind of maximizing efficiency and you want to, say, roast individual blend components on their own without having to manage too many different profiles, right? So say that you have a Costa Rican coffee that you want to sell as a filter single origin coffee, but it's also 40% of your blend for espresso. You might be able to use that same roast profile in the way that you craft your blend. So, rather than having to have one approach for that coffee as single origin, one approach for espresso, you instead decide to use it in a blend where you're building that same idea of balance through the selection of the coffees that you're combining together. So if that hypothetical Costa Rican component brings a lot of citric acidity to your blend, you might use it in a smaller amount, but combined it with a larger quantity of coffee that's primary flavor characteristics are, say, milk chocolate and caramel. So there is that aspect of blending where you can maybe simplify the roast profiles and instead use your skills at the blending table to accommodate somewhat similar goals.
And then when you are addressing blending, I assume you're in most cases a fan of post-roast blending, right?
If you had asked me that question 3 years ago, I would have said yes. Asking me that question today, I would say it depends, but if I can do a pre-roast blend, that's going to be my choice. And I have had, especially as espressos, much better luck blending before roasting. And
so that's it. So that's interesting, Marcus, because we I'll just put myself on camera here. Let's see if I can do this easily. I need to pin myself, right? How does it work? Can you see me now or not?
I can see you just as, the presentation takes front and center, so I can stop the presentation and stop sharing.
Because, okay, now you can see me, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I'm standing here in front of the W6 that for this session I have been preheating this W6A here at Boot Coffee Campus. And Marcus just opened, a really interesting topic. And that's the topic, when do we start blending? Do we blend before roasting or do we blend after roasting? And Marcus now suggests that in the last few years, he has come to the understanding that there might be benefits of blending before roasting. And so there's two types of schools here. One school that tells, hey, we have to blend after roasting. Why is that? Specifically, this is because those folks say, the blend components that go into this espresso blend have to be recognized upon their own merits. The beans have possibly different moisture contents. The density of these beans is different. The flavor profiles of these coffees are just at times radically different. And so each of those components then in this approach should be roasted separately in order to do its work in the blend. And that requires blending after roasting. If you were talking about, let's say, 3 components, that requires a roaster to really understand not just how to strategize the roasting profile for each component, and to keep consistency in terms of development time, keep consistency in terms of color, of course, and that then would require, would enable a roaster to really focus on each of the components in their roasting strategy, and it would require a roaster to be very consistent here, which is not always easy. Of course, the software, Giesen has developed an amazing roast profiler software for this purpose over the past years, really helps with that. Or if you work with Cropster or similar types of roasting software, then that can facilitate this as well, right? So that's the blend after roasting approach, and seems to make a lot of sense. It's similar, like when you're preparing a stew with different ingredients, where you could use carrots and potatoes, and maybe if you are a carnivore, a meat, would you want to put ingredients together and just make them together, or would you prepare some of the ingredients separate, right? And so Marcus, if you then go back to your approach that now says, hey, there are opportunities in doing the blending before roasting. I'm really interested to hear what made you to come to that understanding, and what is your underlying rationale in order to do blending before roasting. Could you highlight or explain that a bit more?
Yeah, of course. I mean, and I think it's, a comment to start this off is that if I'm simply cupping the coffees which are, in a blend, the coffees that are blended after roasting often taste better just on the cupping table. But once I actually take those coffees and prepare them as espresso or with the filter batch brewer, I often find that the pre-roast blend tastes better when prepared kind of as the customer receives the coffee. And so I started thinking about this. I started asking roasters that do a lot of pre-roast blending about their philosophies, and I came to a couple of conclusions. One is that, unlike that stew, preparing coffee doesn't stop at the roaster. It stops in the brew method. And so after roasting, we have grinding, and then we have extraction. And I think, to play the devil's advocate a little bit and talk about why perhaps the post-roast blend doesn't taste as well when brewed. Well, just like all of those components might roast slightly differently because of different densities and other aspects, well, guess what? Once I blend those components together and put them through the grinder, those coffees still might have different densities. They still are going to fracture and grind slightly differently. Moving into my brewing method, they're also going to brew a little bit differently. Like if you wanted to take it to like the logical conclusion, it would be, well, I'm not only going to roast each component separately, but then I'm going to test the solubility of each component, and I'm going to change my roast profile until they have exactly the same level of solubility, and then I'm going to use that approach and blend them. So that, of course, isn't particularly practical. So I think, I just sort of got interested kind of in this theoretically and started trying more and more blends at the same ratios to same basic like roast colors and similar profiles, even using very different coffees. And the results just came out in the cup. Like many times the coffee was better, more balanced, easier to brew deliciously, still maintained characteristics of each individual component, even though I was blending them before roasting. And thinking about what that means in the roasting environment is it's super dynamic in there. And we have conduction that's happening from bean to bean, from drum wall to bean. We have convection that's happening in the system. It's so dynamic that I think even if you have coffees that individually roast somewhat differently, when you put them all together, they actually end up roasting more similarly than you would think. You know, it's not like I see long drawn out first cracks or kind of a dual first crack with two coffees that roast very differently. They actually sort of help each other to roast more consistently in the drum, even if they're very different components.
So could you, thank you. So to kind of to summarize your argument, which is in favor of blending before roasting, is, you know, that you're basically making the case that where it comes to the aspect of consistency, because I think, you know, when we're talking about espresso blends, then we obviously, from a roasting perspective and then from what it ultimately does in the cup, espresso blends are often hallmark products, hallmark flavors for a roasting company or for a cafe. And so clients that come in for their daily cappuccino or their daily shot or their daily espresso beverage, they're probably really looking for consistency, right? So consistency, I would say, as important as it is throughout the espresso value chain, to use that word, consistency in espresso is like key. And so your point is the consistency benefits of blending before roasting because of all those dynamics inside the roaster, beans helping each other basically in creating equilibrium of moisture, of different chemical reactions. That consistency is much better served from what you're saying in the approach of blending before roasting versus the challenges of consistency when you're doing blending after roasting. So that's kind of what I hear from you.
Yeah,
I
mean,
know, you know.
I think it, and you have to extend that all the way to the final extraction as well, right?
You want to pin your screen again?
Yeah, and I think that you're right. It is consistency, but I think it's not just the consistency in the roaster, but it's every single step that happens after roasting, down to the ultimate like solubility and extraction into the cup. That really matters. And you know, and if it was just a consistency argument for me, and the blend that was produced after roasting tasted significantly better, then of course I'm gonna let flavor combined with consistency trump just pure consistency every single time. But in many cases, I would say more than half the time, I actually prefer the flavor profiles of the pre-roast blends, especially when brewed as espresso, more than I do the post-roast blends. And that's what's kind of led me down this path, at least to the point where if I'm developing a blend, I'm always going to try it both ways.
Interesting. I know how fond the coffee community is on discussions, and this is like kind of one of these fundamental topics, blending before or after roasting, that always leads to a lot of polemic. And so that's really interesting. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I know we have quite an audience that has been joining us. Some of you were here since the beginning of our session, which actually started a little bit before, because Marcus and I, we decided to create a program where we can approach the essential topics of today in a way that we also allow ourselves a bit more for discussion. And so those who joined us, we have been covering some ground. We're gradually working towards helping you understand the opportunities for developing flavors for espresso preparation through your roasting machine. And so I will ask Marcus, maybe for those who joined us a little bit later, could we go back to that in your presentation, the slides that really highlight the roasting profile that you showed for a coffee that you worked with prior to this session, and we could learn from that, possibly also to understand better, what opportunities for espresso roasting could work better in terms of the profiling.
Yeah, thanks, Willem. I think that's great, and that's a perfect segue into your live roasting session of Lamula, as you can talk about how you're going to approach that coffee for espresso. In this case, we're going to look at two profiles of a Colombian coffee. And just to quickly summarize, this is also going to be posted as a recording for anyone who missed the first part. But this Colombian coffee, when I taste it on the cupping table, kind of at a cupping roast, is very balanced. It's a lot of sweetness driven by dark chocolate, caramel, kind of a molasses quality, with a really nice kind of punch of citrus flavor and citric acidity in the cup. And so, when I roast that coffee, this is kind of my standard profile for roasting this coffee as a filter brew. What I end up with, and this gives us some of these roasting phases kind of summarized, you can see I end up with a roast with about a 16% development time. This is Agtron color on the whole bean of around 60 to 62. And like I said, when I cup this coffee or taste it as a filter coffee, it's very balanced, a lot of sweetness, a lot of chocolate, and just a little like intrigue from the citric acidity and these sort of deeper citrus flavors. But when I take this coffee and taste it as an espresso, this flavor wheel is what I taste. And this is sort of a typical espresso brew. This is using La Marzocco Linea PB, like not a lot of bells and whistles. We're not pressure profiling or anything. Just an 18-gram dose of coffee with 37.5 grams out. So about a 1-to-2 brew ratio, brew time of about 26 seconds. No visible signs or even in the cup signs of over extraction or under extraction. What I really end up tasting, though, is a very acidic, aggressively citric acidic cup of coffee with a little bit of an interesting sort of honey sweetness, but overall thin, dominated by citrus flavors and citric acidity. Maybe sort of an interesting espresso, but one that I want to take a couple of sips of. One that I don't want to go back and order a second cup. And an espresso that if I put it in milk, it makes the milk taste like sour milk. So to me, this is not a roast profile for this coffee that's a recipe for success, especially in a commercial environment. This would be the espresso most, I think, consumers would think is just like super weird. They would describe it as sour, which is how I described it as well. So I thought about, okay, what can I do to this profile to make it more approachable as espresso? I thought the roast color was appropriate. I didn't want to get into too many flavors of like later sugar browning or into those more carbon driven dark roasted flavors. So I wanted to keep this sort of medium roast. And this is the profile that I came up with for espresso, where I think the key element here is to look at, it's a longer roast time. It's a 2% longer development time as a percentage of the total roast. And the easiest way to see what happened is to look at the kind of orange rate of rise line. And you can see here, I peaked rate of rise, again, fairly early. But then as I got down to that point of color change, that point where we started to see some yellow and the coffee started to smell like hay, I really wanted to have a fairly flat and stable rate of rise. And you can see I accomplished that somewhat with gas changes, but also with that purple line, which is by also increasing airflow at appropriate moments. And and the goal and the sort of theory behind this trial was, let's draw out our browning reactions, especially at the later stage before first crack, where you can really see that rate of rise at about 9 minutes starts declining even more, or at about, I guess, 8 minutes, you see it. It kind of takes its first significant dip. And then let's extend that development time as well. The theory behind that is, let's extend these browning reactions, develop more of these compounds, the various carbohydrates in the coffee. Let's also give it a little bit more time in the roaster, because as you roast longer, the acids continue to degrade. You actually lose citric acid and malic acid if you were to measure them by weight in the roasted coffee. And so, here's my sort of summary. So it was a longer roast time, but with a 2% longer development time as the total roast. And when I ran this through the espresso machine at practically the same brewing recipe, it was now a coffee that to me is much more balanced, where I had sweetness as kind of an overall impact on the coffee is now greatly increased, with more sort of deeper caramel, maple syrup, brown sugar notes, and with this like nice sort of cream quality that also extended to the kind of round body in this particular approach. The dark chocolate kind of gave it that balance of like bittersweet, heft, complexity. There were still some acid-driven flavors, but now instead of just being like a citric acid show, the fruit also was kind of more in line with these deeper, darker flavors. It was more of like a plum, stone fruit, kind of a purple grape. And I remember, and the flavor wheel just didn't capture it, but a distinct dry fruit characteristic, like a prune, raisin kind of quality, which again, it sort of speaks to that heightened sweetness. So by, on the surface, pretty small changes to my roast. I didn't roast darker. I simply drew out the roast time, especially sort of later on, by just a little bit, by like 45 seconds overall, a little bit more time after first crack, and a much more balanced and approachable cup as espresso.
Cool. And so this was a profile you did with a single component coffee, right? I believe it was a Colombian coffee for peace coffee from, I believe, Antioquia, which is one of the largest, most productive regions of Colombia. This approach that you tested and tasted and then tested again in the roaster, would that also be an approach that you would use in, let's say, a blend before roast profile as a benchmark?
Yeah, I think I would. I mean, it would depend on the components. If I was, if I had a blend that was largely comprised of maybe a lower density coffee, say from Minas Gerais, that the primary component was milk chocolate, caramel, and hazelnut, I might take a little bit of a different approach, but I would still be looking at a slightly longer development time. I would be looking at highlighting the sweetness. I would probably extend it even further in the case of a pre-roast blend.
Interesting. And so I can see from the list of participants that we have folks from, it seems like from around the world, Middle East, probably eastern part of Europe, some Latin America. And I want to just welcome everyone to post through the chat window to post your specific questions, because we would love to or through the Q&A. Yeah, the Q&A window, that's the best one actually. Because when we can go into some of your challenges, very specific questions. We have been so far we've been discussing roasting approaches. We've started a discussion about the question, whether or not we should blend before roasting or after roasting, and that's always a very, very interesting topic. But Marcus, could you pin my video?
Your video at the Giesen, yeah?
Yeah.
There you are.
Thank you. It's always challenging to operate all these switches at the same time. And you can see the sun is coming straight into the lab here, which is nice, but it's kind of a curveball in terms of how to manage this presentation well with the light. But I've been here. This is our W6A that we have here at Boot Coffee Campus. We have a number of other Giesen machines installed here. You can see behind me, you can see the WPG1, which is just a wonderful machine. I cannot express enough how much I like roasting with that sample roaster. And then next to that, you see a W1A, which is the 1 to 1.5 kilo batch roaster. And so for the purpose of this exercise today, we have preheated this Giesen for well over 20 minutes. And you can see, this roaster, the components of the Giesen, one of the more prolific components is the cast iron faceplate, plus the cast iron parts that hold together the drum. The drum is made of mild steel, but then it's held together by cast iron parts. And I think, cast iron, also when we talk about espresso roasting, cast iron is kind of a porous material, relatively speaking. It's hard enough to feel like a very dense brick, so it's a very hard material. But in relation to other types of metals, it is somewhat porous. That allows you to also heat and cool the material gradually. And the specifically the properties of how cast iron has the ability to conduct heat to the coffee is really interesting. One of the challenges that, for example, roasters have that, let's say, have stainless steel components is that, when you have hot spots with these stainless steel components, whether it's the drum or whether it's the faceplate, is that can create tipping and scorching. And with cast iron components, you minimize that risk. I always talk where we discuss cast iron in perspective of that it helps, it facilitates sweetness for that reason, because it allows you to conduct heat very gently. And I see some questions coming in, and Marcus, feel free to maybe look at some of the questions so we can, while I talk, also interrupt. Yeah. Is there a question?
I think there's two that we can that make sense to answer right now. And the first is Khalid asking, is there a specific coffee origin best for espresso? You want to take that one, Willem? I think that's a really fun question.
It's a fun one. And this goes back, I'm thinking now back when I started my career in coffee. My brother and I developed a roasting company in the Netherlands, and the philosophy we were using was to focus on single origin coffee only. So we were kind of the trends that we saw much later. We were kind of pioneering that quite early back in the Netherlands. And so we actually had a repertoire of, I believe, 8 or 9 different origins, single origins, for specifically for espresso. So we were doing something that was not quite usual that time. And I can tell you, that was both fascinating because a single origin Kenya espresso is not it's not easy to do, but once you hit the sweet spot with a Kenyan coffee roasted for espresso, you create a very unique profile that is not easy to copy by your competition. Obviously, when we're talking about, what is the suitable or the coffee of choice, the origin of choice for espresso, then a lot of roasters would immediately think of the big giant coffee producing origin, Brazil. And why is it that they then choose for Brazil? Because Brazil coffees seem to, in the eyes of those proponents, seem to promote the aspect of sweetness most. It's also a component that is very suitable for blending. It's very suitable for multiple purposes. However, I would recommend that you really open your eyes for other options, other origins. You could think, when we're looking at Latin American coffees, an origin like Costa Rica or an origin like Panama can create very unique flavors in the cup where it comes to espresso. I can testify you to the fact that my brother and I, we built our company, Boat Coffee, which is the Dutch version of Boot Coffee. Boat Coffee in the Netherlands built its business for a great deal on the concept of roasting and promoting single origin coffees from Panama. In most cases, roasted for espresso preparation, because for a long time that has been the preparation of choice in Panama. In the Netherlands. The presence of espresso machines started already in the late 1950s in Holland. So other, interesting origins for espresso, I would mention Rwanda. I would mention, obviously, Ethiopia. I would love to mention an origin like India. And that's just to name a few. In other words, as wide as our options are, as diverse our options are for the choice of coffees, for the choice of espresso, it's really a matter of, what is available in your neck of the woods, in your town, with what do importers bring in, and with which of these coffees can you also do more than just have maybe for a few months have a unique coffee, but how consistent can you be with these components? And I think, where it comes to espresso types, espresso components, it's really also about, creating a signature flavor for what your brand, for what your company can do. Think of, for example, a well-known company like Intelligentsia that has had for, as long as I can remember, Intelligentsia has been promoting this Black Cat blend, which grew into a Black Cat program. And that blend, that program focuses on presenting specific, unique flavor profiles, which allow the blend to change in components depending on the seasonality of the components or depending on what is available at that moment, at that time. So various companies have been trying to mimic or trying to um, like intelligence, have been trying to create our own versions of this black cat and have been quite successful at it. So, Marcus, according to, in your perspectives, when it comes to the choice for origins, which origins would come to mind from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would just summarize what you said, which
You want
is,
to pin your video?
all right. Yeah, I think I would just really summarize what you said, Willem. I think that any origin is potentially a great origin for espresso, and it's knowing sort of your personal tastes and preferences and what kind of a signature you want to have on the coffee, but also knowing your market and what people are looking for. So I think, yeah, I don't have much to add. I would, um, I would just say exactly that. Like, don't be afraid to try multiple coffees as espresso and see what you like the best and what resonates with customers. So
Cool. I think we should maybe slowly start to get ready for a roasting session.
I agree. Yep,
If you could pin my video in this feed on the roaster again.
absolutely. There you go.
Yep. Perfect. So
And
now,
just one comment. Some of these other questions that are here, I'll type some answers into chat while you're roasting,
cool.
and folks can see those answers there as well.
So I'm going to use a coffee that is very dear to me, dear to us, because it's a coffee from a farm I started about 13 years ago in 2007. And this is, you can see the bag here, Finca La Mula, Panama. This is a geisha coffee, right? So I'm actually using this Giesen webinar to also plug my own coffee, to promote my own coffee, which is great. Gives us the opportunity to do a lot of things at the same time. So first question is, why would you consider using a very exclusive coffee for espresso? And obviously, the consideration here is that it provides you the possibility, the opportunity to offer, to create a flavor that no one else in your neck of the woods can create. So the level of uniqueness that you can develop by roasting a espresso coffee component and using a geisha for this, that obviously creates an opportunity. At the same time, it's also potentially a recipe for disaster if you're not being able to accomplish the goals that you have in mind. And I would say, where it comes to the flavor profile of this La Mula geisha, then I'm thinking often on 3 different flavor layers that this coffee features, whether it's in a pour over or in cupping or in espresso. So I think of the base flavors, which are a type of chocolate, but it's really base flavors of blackberry, raspberry, which are by themselves quite acidic type of fruits, and that acidity of this La Mula has to be taken into account. Also, the elevation of the coffee is 1700 to 1800 meters, which is on average more than 150 meters higher than most farms in Panama. So that acidity, in order to create balance and sweetness, we have to really try to roast that coffee to in terms of balance, in a way that we can manage that acidity, so that the barista, once she or he gets to the espresso machine with this La Mula espresso, isn't just frantically trying to tame this acidity. So you will want to try to already tame the acidity, to balance out the acidity here in your roasting machine. And for that purpose, in this live roasting session, we're going to attempt to extend the Maillard reactions so that we can lead where the browning of the coffee starts to the point where the caramelization becomes now a predominant set of chemical reactions. We will want to extend these browning reactions, these Maillard reactions, so that once we start into the caramelization phase, which will start somewhere around 300 degrees, 310 degrees Fahrenheit, that we do this gradually enough without over roasting the coffee. You know, I think in all circumstances, and specifically where it comes to espresso, over roasting your espresso is a sin. Over roasting a geisha, if you would use that for espresso, that's a really mortal sin, because it would mean that you're masking now the flavor, the unique flavor of this coffee with, you know, burnt sugar or caramelized sugar, which is by itself not a great flavor. And so we will really want to try to develop the sweetness of the coffee accordingly. So I have, let's see, I have done some homework here. This is actually the roasted coffee that I did in the pre-trial about 8-9 days ago. And I measured the roast color of this bean at 61.5 on the Electron scale. And we use a color meter for that purpose, which is calibrated to the Electron scale. And then to show you the beans I'm using, here is a tray with the beans. Of course, you know, it's not easy to get a good grasp on these beans from where you are, but I can kind of observe on your behalf. When I look at these beans, this is the La Mula Geisha. I'm looking at a coffee that is dense. And I've actually measured this coffee using a graduated cylinder, and the density is about 70 kilograms per hectoliter, which is a relatively high density, which means that the coffee would appreciate at some point during the roast sufficient heat input. Otherwise, the coffee could come out with having some, you know, like underdeveloped, like raw, maybe even peanut shell flavor notes. And knowing that espresso is a brewing style that's kind of, you know, turns up the volume of everything, we don't want to turn up the volume. We don't even want to have the presence of these types of flavors. So here we have a coffee that is relatively dense, but at the same time, it's a geisha type, which also creates the opportunity to try to highlight the notes of citrus, the notes of the raspberry, blackberry, and then hopefully the aromatics as a result will be as such where we really say, wow, here we have a very unique flavor profile driven through this geisha identity of the coffee. So that's kind of the challenge you have. I have done my measurement of moisture. It measured at 10.2%, which is in the range of the acceptable range. Now I'm using the W6A, the 6 kilo Giesen. I'm going to roast 5 kilos of this coffee. So I'm going to roast this at well, about 80% capacity. And let's get started. I'm a bit nervous for this because I usually prefer to do this by myself so that I can be my own observer when I screw up. And now I have many eyes pointed towards me. And so I'm going to set up my computer here because I'm going to share my screen showing you the Giesen profiler. Marcus, could you pin? Oh, yeah, perfect. We're already there. So this is the Giesen profiler software that you're looking at, and it's basically shows you the preheating parameters, the preheating curve, which basically means I have set the roaster to maintain a temperature, an air temperature of 325 degrees Fahrenheit. In order to maintain that, I've basically used the thermostat function of the roaster for that purpose. What is the thermostat function on the Giesen? It basically is a function that allows you to consistently maintain a distinct environmental air temperature. And I'm going to use this approach, this thermostat roasting approach, in combination with the adjustment of the flame level. And so for this purpose, for the purpose of today, I'm first going to charge the beans into the preheated drum. And at that point, I'm going to leave the flame off. And so now I'm, let's see, I have, where is my cursor? Okay. So it says power off. This basically means the flame is off. I have preheated the machine to 325 degrees. I'm going to load my beans. 5 kilos, 80% batch capacity. And then we are off roasting. There we go. And so how do I determine the time during which I keep the flames off? I'm basically now going to look at the point where the rate of rise is going to become positive. So this basically means at the moment that the rate of rise becomes positive, then at that point, the beans start absorbing heat. It's a turning point, basically. And at that point, I'm very gradually going to increase my flame level. Marcus, the sound is okay, right? Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, the sound is good. I can hear the roaster, but you're coming through clear.
Okay, perfect. So now, and the Giesen gives you this toggle function where you can gradually increase your power. And I'm going to gradually now increase my environmental temperature. And I will set it to 350. And I'm going to limit my flame level to, at this point, 50%. So what I'm doing right now is I'm looking at the environmental set point, which is 350. My environmental temperature right now, as you can see, is quite low. It's 217. So at this point, we're allowing the roaster to provide heat to the beans at a 50% flame level. And I'm going to raise it up a little bit more right now to get to 80%. why 80%? Because I'm roasting 80% of the bed capacity of the roaster. So I'm, for that purpose, I'm using, in terms of the flame level, as the high level for the flame level for the heat input, I'm using 80%. And so you can see on the screen, you can see gradually the bean temperature curve in red and the air temperature curve in blue. They start building up, and we can also see that my rate of rise curve is now building up. My rate of rise is now 16 degrees, which is the temperature increase in Fahrenheit for 30 seconds. The rate of rise kind of gives us the indication, like in a car, of what the speed of your car is. So the faster your car goes, the faster you get to your destination. In this scenario, the higher my rate of rise is, the faster I get to my endpoint. And Mark has already explained as a rule of as a rule basically for espresso roasting, is that we want to extend the time during which the Maillard reactions unfold. And Marcus, at what point would you say that these Maillard reactions really start developing during this profile we're doing right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's indicative by the sensory feedback you're getting in your trier, by a point where, the coffee is clearly dry. Like when you smell it, there's no more of that wet grass. And it's probably a little bit beyond where you start smelling like just a pure hay smell. I think on this machine, and having roasted Lamula on this machine as well, I would expect your bean temperature to be approaching or on the Fahrenheit, about 325 degrees is where I would expect Maillard to sort of be underway on this roaster with that coffee.
Okay.
So that
So
gives
right
you a
now,
target for yellowing.
yeah. And so I'm, Marcus, could you pin my video feed on the roaster so I can? Could you?
Your video of your person, right?
Of me in person, yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
That may not be possible to overwrite the screen share. You might have to end your screen share. Yeah.
Now you should be able, right?
Now I can do it. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And now, yeah, perfect. So, hello, Brett. So here Marcus was just mentioning smelling your trier, comparing what you smell with the trier with where you are in your roast profile on your Giesen profiler software. And we are now at a bean temperature of 298 to be precise. So we're getting close to this point where our reactions really are in full swing. And so in this point, we are roasting wise, we are at 6 minutes, 40 seconds. So I'm already setting up this roast profile to evolve slower than I would do in the case of a roast for pour over or a roast for cupping. And so that is
Willem, this
really
is great.
Yeah.
I just wanted to jump in because we did have a question that I answered by typing, which was about what impact does this sort of drying phase, or this phase from the time you charge the green coffee until we see yellowing, have
Marcus,
on.
Marcus, you want to just put yourself on screen because I need to charge one of my
Yep,
camera
yep,
at my phone here. So you can,
perfect.
yeah. If you can start focusing on that question.
Yeah, so I mean, Ryan here in the questions asked, what would extending the lead up to drying net any positive results, or do I consider the Maillard and onwards more important? Which is a great question. And drying 100% matters. I think in some very rudimentary trials that I've done with the TDS meter and cupping bowls, but that have also been duplicated by other coffee pros, right? It's a simple test of like, well, what if I roast coffee to the same basic roast time, same basic roast color, but in one case I have a 5-minute drying time, and another maybe I have a 6 or 6.5 minute drying time. What are the results in the cup? And it seems that with slightly longer drying times, you actually end up with coffee that is more easily soluble when you start brewing. So I usually look for a drying time that's about 50 to 55% of my total roast time. And I find that it really does lead to balanced coffees that are quite forgiving in their brewing methods, and especially with espresso. But of course, overly extending the drying time could mean you just don't have enough energy in your coffee, and you end up sort of losing the momentum, and you're not able to sort of drive into a pronounced first crack and through your total development time.
So right now, as you can see on the screen, we are gradually bringing down this rate of rise. We're now 9 minutes into this roast. Marcus, could you maybe give some observations on what's going on while I'm manipulating the controls here?
Yeah, perfect. The first thing that I would recommend though, Willem, is you probably want to keep increasing your set point a little bit.
Yeah.
And at the corresponding time, also decreasing your power, your maximum power.
Yep.
Because
increasing my set point to, let's take 390, and I'm going to reduce my power to 40 at this point. So now I reduced my maximum power from 80 to 40.
I think you could even reduce your maximum power to 20 or 25. Okay. So yeah, what we're doing here, and the reason that I recommended that is, what the way that the set point can work is it's a fairly advanced control, either using the profiling system as Willem is, or using the just the controls on the roaster. And the set point says, roaster, I don't want my air temperature to exceed this set temperature. And that says, roaster, you can take control of my gas in whatever way you see necessary to keep my air temperature from exceeding this set point.
So Marcus, could you, let's see, I'm going to stop share, and then could you pin my video on my roasting machine here? So, because we are in first crack, and at this point, I'm going to try to slow things down. What I'm actually going to do, I'm going to bring my set point down, and I'm also going to bring down my power, my flame level, and which I did. And let me share again the screen here with you so you can see what's going on. And now I'm going to take my flame level to 1%, the lowest possible setting.
But I think it is good. It is important to realize your burner is actually off right now anyway,
yep,
because your set point is low enough that it's keeping your burner from taking off. And it's also interesting to see there's enough energy in this coffee that, you know, you're keeping a positive rate of rise. And there with that set point adjustment, now he has that 1% power.
And so we're now 15% development. I'm going to aim this roast towards an 18% development. That's what I did with the roast that we did 7-8 days ago. So we're very close to finishing this roast. Always exciting. Marcus, could you pin my video on my roaster? I'll stop sharing here. And we're now at the moment supreme.
Looks good.
Terrifying to do this live. So let's go back to the Giesen profiler and to make some, let's stop this roast. And so I will share my screen so you can actually see what's going on now. Okay, so here, so Marcus, let's make some observations. My first observation is because I stopped the roast on my software later or after I discharged the coffee, it seems like, according to the software, that I had development percentage of 23%. Actually, in effect, when I discharged the coffee, it was almost 19%. So I would say, in terms of the development time and percentage, I think we accomplished our goal, right? But what other observation could you give, Marcus?
Yeah, I mean, I think it looks like a well-controlled roast. Yeah, for me, this would be a great profile to save kind of as a reference, but I would probably still look to make some adjustments. You know, I think at that 9-minute mark, where there was a combination of set point adjustments and gas adjustments, I would want to just simplify what was happening there a little bit. And I think, you know, what we probably could have accomplished was, you know, right before 10 minutes, the rate of rise makes that little dip, and then it kind of comes back up again before dipping. Boy, I think it would have been really nice, and the results will be in the cup, and I didn't hear the quality of the first crack. But boy, when it made that little dip in rate of rise at like 9.5 minutes, it would have been great to see that sort of maintain at a more steady rate of, say, like 5 degrees per Fahrenheit per 30 seconds, more into and through first crack. I think it would have been an easier roast to maybe control right at the end. But yeah, the results are in the cup. There's nothing that's a major red flag or anything in this roast. It looks great.
Good. Now let me go back to my other position here in the campus, and then Marcus, maybe we can start to focus on some more questions.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and I think there is a good question about this profile, which was the replicability of the profile, because at the last part, the ROR is a bit hectic in the sense of not being able to be replicated. I actually disagree that it was hectic. I think that there was a little, you know, a little bit of a spike that happened right at the end, but that's very common with this roaster. I see that on many profiles that we roast on the W6, and it's likely just indicative of the sensitivity and the location of the thermocouple as much as it is anything that's happening in the roaster. So that's sort of my thought about that rate of rise. But I also think that if we had kept a little bit of a higher rate of rise more consistently, kind of leading into first crack, it may have also accomplished a little bit of a smoother line, as the commenter is sort of discussing. I don't worry too much about the shape of this stuff if it tastes good and if I can repeat it. And I know on this roaster that would be a fairly replicable rate of rise, especially the way that you're using set point. The roaster will accomplish that.
Yeah, there are
machine.
of course there are of course the some of the self-proclaimed gurus of roasting that are very dogmatic where it comes to the shape of the rate of rise curve. And you know, there's a lot to say, of course, for the importance of having a rate of rise curve that is continually declining from the moment that it gets its high peak. Keep into mind, however, also that with the data that is gathered with the different probes, and at the point where you're taking actually a sample with your trier, you will, regardless, under all circumstances, you will get a flick in your curve, because when you remove the sampler briefly, the temperature probe might just briefly get the lower ambient temperature from the air coming in through your trier. That does not necessarily mean that the coffee will sense that same impact.
Yeah, there's been this trend, right, of like so many roasters have read some books and things, and they've gone out and replaced their thermocouples with these very sensitive measuring devices. Well, how much of that is noise, right, versus how much of that is really indicative of a measurement of what's happening in your coffee bean? So, you know, I like a thermocouple that's responsive enough that I can see what's happening to my coffee, but that's not so responsive that I just pick up a lot of, I don't know, unnecessary noise, right?
There's another question here. If I want to reuse this roast profile, the roaster will automatically run the entire process. That's correct. So the Giesen profiler records all the changes you do on the burner settings, the settings for your environmental temperature, your airflow setting, which we kept for this purpose at 140 PA, Pascal. And if I save this profile, which I already did, and I do my next La Mula profile, then the roasting machine will repeat that under the condition that I have to use the same amount of coffee. I have to use the same time to preheat my roaster. So I have to repeat all the other environmental conditions. Yeah.
And I would say that, yeah, don't, you know, since this was really the first roasting batch of the day, even though you had a long preheat time, I probably wouldn't use the first roast batch of the day to record my sort of standard profile. I would want it to be, you know, once there's more momentum in the roaster for the second, third, fourth roast, it'll be more repeatable.
Here is the special offer of the day, is that anyone who is interested can receive a 150 or 100 gram roasted sample of this coffee at no cost, but the only cost you incur is you pay for the shipping, and we have very low shipping rates. And so I invite you through the Q&A section to share your email address, so we can basically confirm this shipment to you. So if you would like to receive in your mailbox the roasted coffee from this session of today, then just, you know, send us your email right now, and we will connect with you to prepare this shipment for you. So that's kind of a cool opportunity to link what is happening here with this Giesen in this session, with the actual tasting of the coffee. By the time the coffee will arrive, which is probably, you know, if you are far away, and some of you are far away, then it will have been degassing quite a bit already. So it will then have a representative flavor profile for what you would normally want to do with your espresso. And maybe that is then a great opportunity to also see what the La Mula Geisha could do for your business in general. We're getting close to the hour here. Is there anything we forgot to cover? Marcus, I think we could continue with this for probably a day or so.
I know,
it's fun.
and there's some great
Yeah.
questions coming through the chat, but I just encourage folks to maybe tune in next time and continue, because we do cover some of these every time we run this webinar. So
yeah, so Marcus, could you maybe put up the slide where we share the webinars that we teach in addition to this Giesen webinar with some dates?
yeah,
I think
of course.
we always,
Yeah, we have some
there you
great
go.
webinars coming up. You know, they're all relevant to this class, but probably the most relevant to this webinar is this elements of roast profiling, where we really do talk about approaches to roasting to showcase acidity or to showcase more sweetness. We talk about knowing your green coffee from the standpoint of density, moisture, age, flavor goals, and then outline some general roasting approaches to accomplish those. The cupping together is just a great class if you're interested in tasting and sort of understanding what we mean by quality coffee, where every student receives a box in the mail with at least 6 different coffees to taste, to describe. And after some training in how to use the SCA cupping form and scoring, we all try scoring the same coffees together and calibrating around how we did. And then for the entrepreneurs in the house, there's also a business course that we offer that really, it covers all of the ins and outs of choosing the appropriately sized roasting machine, to calculating your cost of goods and a 1, 2, 3, 4-year budget, as well as marketing and branding yourself as you're building your roasting company. So some really cool webinars. It'd be fun to see some of you there as well.
And then before we close this session, there's a question: if Giesen supplies or sells some basic profiles to be used with the roaster for beginners, it will be really hard and expensive to create profiles. Yes and no. Let me start first with the no, because the profiles that we, let's say, do here, if you try to repeat this profile in your own environment, it's not necessarily going to do the same thing, because let me put my pin on. Perfect. If you're recreating the profile with your machine, you also have to take into account that your gas type, your gas pressure, your airflow, your ambient temperature might be or will be different, which is challenging then to repeat a profile. But I recommend that you look at the bigger picture of the profile that we did today, the ambient temperature setting or the environmental temperature setting, the approach of using the gas supply during this roast, and then the trigger points that we used to reduce heat input at some point. And I think where it comes to developing profiles, that obviously always requires some work, some testing. And we are happy to assist you with this. We have been working with clients around the world for that purpose. And so as a first step, John, feel free to send us a couple of samples of what you have been accomplishing so we can critique the flavors and can help you improve these profiles with our suggested adjustments. That's probably the best way to deal with that. Having said that, it's now just over the top of the hour. I think it was a great session, Marcus. This is cool. I think since Espresso is so diverse, we should really possibly repeat this using some other coffees, maybe combine it with some hands-on extraction on the espresso machine and try to correlate extraction methods with roasting styles. That could be exciting as well.
I agree. I agree.
Yeah. Cool. So thank you, everyone. I wish you great health, great luck. I know that around the world, businesses start getting into their normal self again, which is great. And so we will see you again in the April webinar, which is the last Friday of April. I do not know by heart which date that exactly is, but it's the last Friday of April, always at 9 a.m. Pacific time. That's always the hour at which we start. And see you soon. Arrivederci, salut, tot ziens, ciao, and so many more. Okay, bye-bye.
Adios.